I just got second place at the NAWCQ playing the Giant Card event, where I was able to take home an oversized copy of Molchummy Purrely, and the deck I was able to do that with was Tenpai Dragon. Now I ended up going 7-1, going undefeated until the very last round where I lost in the finals, but I felt that this list was pretty good and I wanted to explain some of my reasoning for playing certain cards. So without any further ado, let's just hop straight into it. So I'm just going to start off with the engine, very standard, nothing to explain here, 3 Pydra, 3 Chandra. But I did choose to only play one copy of Genroku, the new one, and my reasoning for that was because I felt like the deck had a few too many normal summons. So I ultimately decided to play one, since when I did the math on the deck, with the number of starters that you're playing, you should be seeing one essentially like 95-97% of the time when you're going second in your 6-card hand. So I figured that one Genroku was enough, and from my experience, it was fine. I never lost the game because I hard drew Genroku or didn't have one in my deck. So although you could play 2 copies of it, I decided to cut it down to 1 because I wanted to maximize on the number of non-engine that I was playing. I also played 1 copy of Fadra. I think 1 is all you need. This deck isn't really trying to go for any grind games or anything. It's a card you don't really want to see in your hand, and especially since I'm playing Dimension Shifter, I just figured its effect wouldn't be that relevant in those games, so I decided to only play 1, and from my experience, it worked out fine. For the Sangen spells and traps, 3 summoning, 1 terraforming, and 3 Kaimin. Very standard, nothing to talk about there. You usually maximize on these cards for consistency. And then 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity. Pot of Prosperity was, of course, really good, helps you dig into those starters. One problem I did find with it, though, was sometimes when I was going second, since a lot of my deck is hand traps, there aren't actually too many great cards to dig for, aside from Forbidden Droplets, which I'm playing. So that was sometimes a problem when my hand was already good enough. But aside from those cases where I just kept it in my hand and didn't really use it, it was really good helping me be able to find side deck cards post game 1 and starter cards when I didn't have any in my hand. Then next up, I guess for the non-engine, Bestial Magma. This card is pretty insane, helps you get to engine, and is a pretty solid disruption against the Fiendsmith deck. Nothing really to say here. I chose not to play any main deck Bestials other than Magma. And then for the hand traps, for the rest of them, 3 copies of Shifter. I think this one's obviously the best one, and one of the reasons to actually play this deck. From my experience in the tournament, I ended up playing 3 Fiendsmith Yubels and 3 Fiendsmith Snake-Eye. I was able to beat all of them except for 1 Snake-Eye opponent in the finals. This card was definitely the MVP, and I feel like every time you resolve this, you're just winning the game, so you definitely need to play this if you're playing Tempai. Droll Lockbird fulfills like a similar role as Shifter. It's never going to be, I guess, as insane as Shifter is, but against something like Yubel, it has the potential to be even more impactful than Shifter, and I just wanted as many high impact hand traps in my deck as possible. Speaking of high impact hand traps, next I played 3 copies of Nibiru. Since I was playing so many hand traps, I wanted to play a hand trap that paired really well with all of them, and Nibiru definitely was that hand trap. Pairs really well, of course, with Valor and Imperm, but also if you just make it so you're able to stop some of their extension, it makes it a lot harder for decks to get to a negation like Appaloosa before I can drop Nib on them. And from my experience throughout the whole weekend, Nib was pretty solid, so I definitely would play it again in the future. And then next up, 3 copies of Ash. And then for the effect negators, I ended up playing 3 Valor, and even though Valor does conflict with Shifter, my logic was that if I'm resolving Shifter against the deck, I'm not going to really need any other hand traps because they're just not going to be able to do anything. Because in the hands where you don't draw Shifter, Valor alone against a deck like Snake-Eyes or Yubel does have the potential to cut off one of their main plays like Snake-Eyes Ash or Samsara Lotus. Of course, similar argument for Infinite Impermanence, except Imperm's a little better, can be used going second. And then finally, the only board breaker I played in my deck was 3 copies of Droplet. When I was building the deck, I wanted to play more hand traps, and in this final 3 slots, I couldn't really figure out what hand trap to put. I ultimately ended up going with Droplet because my logic was I wanted as many good standalone cards as possible. So cards like Droll and Lockbird and Shifter can certainly solo certain games on their own, and a card like Droplet can do that as well. If you, let's say, don't see the right hand traps or don't see that many hand traps, Droplet actually has the potential to break some of the boards out there and let you win the game on its own. Similar reasoning with Valor, even though it conflicts with Shifter, I figured if I'm resolving Shifter, then I should be winning the game anyways. So that was it for the main deck, 40 cards. I don't know if there's anything I would change aside from maybe considering a card like Phantasme. Moving on to the extra deck, for the 7s, 2 copies of Bident. Nothing to say about that, it's pretty standard. The 2 copies of Black Rose, both of them came up throughout the tournament. I thought they were pretty solid. One note, I'm not playing Kui Belt, the one that pops, so Moonlight Dragon kind of fulfills the role of getting rid of big bodies that can't really be killed by battle. So for example, like a Nibiru token or something like that. I figured Moonlight just fulfills the same role, but also does it better because you could do things like bounce Flamberge to the hand and you won't have to trigger its grave effect. I never really missed Kui Belt, but I could see myself putting it back in the extra deck because it does offer some unique utility that this deck doesn't necessarily have. One copy of Meteor Burst. Meteor Burst was for the mirror match. I didn't really make it that much, but it's very good when it comes up. And then Samurai Destroyer. Samurai Destroyer was pretty strong, very good against Yubel, of course, but also surprisingly against a deck like Runick Stun. Ending on Samurai Destroyer actually wasn't the worst thing in the world because it's actually pretty hard for them to out without a card like Dimension Fisher on the board, because every time they destroy it by card effects, it can just keep coming back. But aside from that, it also has a very solid effect where you're able to do crazy things in the battle. I was trying out Time Lord Vorpgate, and I feel like Vorpgate does come up as well, to where when you're not able to kill them, you can essentially Dragon Lock yourself with the Bident Dragon and then summon Vorpgate after you banish their entire field. They don't come back because they're not dragons. So that was something I did consider as well, but I ultimately ended up going with Samurai Destroyer, and it was a pretty good choice in the end. Moving on to the 10s, one copy of Transcendent Dragon. I think one is all you need. One copy of Ruddy Rose. This is really good because it helps you not only play under a card like Skill Drain since it's so big, but it also helps you clear out follow-up from decks like Snake-Eyes and Yubel when you're not able to kill them. And then, of course, Trident Dragon. This did come up a few times for me, so I would, of course, play it if you have access to it. And then for the Link Monsters, one copy of Seals. I never really found myself needing 2 copies of Seals because once you resolve one, you should just be winning the next turn most of the time, unless they have something crazy. For the other links, one copy of Striker, one copy of SP Little Knight. These don't come up very often, aside from when you get barriered, but they're pretty good in the cases that you do. And of course, when you're not able to kill your opponent and you're not Dragon Locked, you could just end up going into SP Little Knight and have some further disruption from there. For the other links, I played one copy of Hida. Never made it, but it's important to play because it's good in the mirror. Could be good into other fire decks as well. And same thing with Princess. I never made it, but in theory, it's pretty good for follow-up when you just have a bunch of random bodies on the board. And the final card I played was Typhon. My logic with Typhon was that in a hand trap war, it could be very strong. If you hand trap your opponent, they have kind of a weak board, but then they hand trap like your one starter or something like that, you can slap this on top and then clear their board, and they kind of control the game from there with the biggest body on the board. It did come up once for me when my opponent just ended on Wave High King C0 after I hand trapped him, and I was able to essentially win that game because I was able to summon my guy, make this, bounce it, and then just kill him on the next turn. So I'd say Typhon's a pretty strong card, and I'd definitely play it again. Now moving on to the side deck, I thought this was probably the most interesting part of my deck, and the first card I played was 3 copies of Power Filter. This card was there for Yubel and for Snake-Eyes. If you look at all their monsters, they're essentially all under 1000 attack, and that's huge because that essentially is like a one-sided Vandy's Emptiness, because the only card this affects in your deck is Genroku, but that doesn't really matter when it's shutting off your opponent's essentially entire deck. It's also important because it shuts off the Fiendsmith engine, since Requiem has less than 1000 attack as well. If you've watched other Nats profiles as well, you'll notice other players were playing this. And I think this is just an incredibly strong tech card that definitely caught some of my opponents off guard, and it definitely helped me win some of those key Fiendsmith matchups. So I'm very happy I played this, and in a format that's full of Snake-Eyes and Yubel, I definitely think I keep this in my side deck in the future. And then for the other going first cards, one copy of Drago for the Light and Dark decks to summon off of Seals. And then I chose to play one copy of Grand Tusk Dragon just for every other deck out there. The most I was ending on turn 1 was probably just going to be Seals and hand traps. I wanted my Seals to beat as many disruptions as possible, and Grand Tusk just gives you the opportunity to do that, since against every deck, popping 2 is pretty strong, and against the Light and Dark decks, having a Vandy's Emptiness is also really strong. So even though it's not great to draw, it was pretty worth it in the end just to play it, and it did definitely catch a few of my opponents off guard. And then for the other going first cards, I ended up playing one copy of Anti-Spell. This was a pretty last minute addition. I wanted something that was super high impact going first, and that could apply to a lot of decks. And I figured Anti-Spell was pretty strong for that. I never really saw it, but it ended up being pretty strong. Rivalry for a similar reason. Rivalry alone can destroy some of the decks like Snake-Eyes, Fiendsmith out there. I also chose to play one copy of Call by the Grave, and these two were originally different dimension grounds, but I ultimately changed it to these two since I figured Call by was pretty strong going first. It's good going second into even some decks as well, so I figured may as well try it. I didn't really see it all weekend, but in theory it was supposed to be really good because it can stop cards like Phantom of Yubel and stop cards like Heretic Seal in the mirror match. And I chose to play one copy of Druisworm as well since I wanted a Bestial to search off of Magma. Druisworm did go into my main deck a few times because there was a lot of Fiendsmith that I ended up facing. For the last 6 cards, I ended up playing Fenrir. I was finding out my siding patterns. I realized that Fenrir has a lot of coverage into sort of the random decks that I didn't have enough coverage into with the current side deck. It also fulfilled some extra roles in helping me side out additional cards that aren't good in certain matchups. So for example, in the Tempai matchup, a card like Baylor is really bad, so I would put in this over it and it'd give me enough cards to actually side in. And Fenrir, from my experience, was really good to help me win a lot of games. And I think that in this deck specifically, since you are playing something like Shifter, just putting out extra bodies on the board that can threaten a lot of damage and pressure is incredibly good. And I think that, of course, going first, it's a solid addition to your end board. The only thing I will say is that this does make you lose a little harder to Molchummy Purrely, but I never got hit with that card in this event, so it was okay. And then finally, 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone. These went into every single matchup because decks like Yubel, decks like Snake-Eyes, they are going to play skill drain pretty much whether you're going first or going second. So I think that it was important to have outs in your main decks to skill drain, and Cosmic was really good all weekend. I will say though, I didn't really respect that many back row decks like Runick Stun. When I did some testing against the deck, I realized the matchup was pretty much unwinnable if your opponent opened decently. And I figured at that point, okay, I know I'm going to need to get lucky to beat this matchup most of the time. So I decided to just not put dedicated cards for back row. I felt that Cosmic had enough applications both going first and going second to where it was worth playing in the side deck. And I definitely don't regret playing it. I might even consider like maining it just because of how strong it was. So that's going to do it for the deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did end up playing this for the main event at Nationals, but I didn't do very well. In the 6 rounds that I did play, I didn't play a single Fiendsmith deck when my deck was pretty much built for them. So maybe that's one reason I can attribute to my loss. But at the end of the day, I also could have just played better. So there isn't really too much to say about that. On the Friday where I played the Giant card, this deck worked exceptionally well. And I was having a very good time into those Fiendsmith decks with the way it was built. So with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching. And I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.